In 83 episodes, Lost in Space gave 1960s television almost everything imaginable. Space hippies, werewolves, giant vegetables, and a cowardly doctor who could turn disaster into comedy. But 3 episodes became so bizarre, so embarrassing, or so controversial in the show's history that decades later, people still talk about them as if television wanted them buried. One allegedly got 2 stars suspended, another exposed just how far the series had fallen into camp, and the strangest part is that the truth behind these banned episodes may be even better than the legend. So what really happened? To understand why those 3 episodes became notorious, you have to remember what Lost in Space was supposed to be. When CBS premiered the series on September 15, 1965, Irwin Allen wasn't trying to make a comedy about giant carrots. The Robinsons were a family attempting something extraordinary, leaving Earth aboard the Jupiter 2 for Alpha Centauri. Professor John Robinson, his wife Maureen, their children Judy, Penny, and Will, along with pilot Don West, were supposed to carry a genuine family adventure into deep space, and CBS had already spent heavily on that idea. The original unaired pilot, No Place to Hide, was reportedly produced for roughly $600,000, an enormous television budget in 1965. Even more striking, the elaborate Jupiter 2 interior has often been reported as costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Whatever the exact accounting, this wasn't conceived as disposable children's television. Irwin Allen wanted spectacle. But there was a problem. That first pilot didn't contain the 2 characters who would eventually overwhelm almost everything else, the robot and Dr. Zachary Smith. Smith entered the broadcast version as a saboteur, a genuinely dangerous man whose actions sent the Robinson family helplessly off course. Jonathan Harris, however, quickly realized that a straightforward villain had nowhere to go. Once Smith had sabotaged the mission, why would the Robinsons tolerate him? So Harris began reshaping him. The cold spy gradually became vain, cowardly, theatrical, and ridiculously self-important. His relationship with young Will Robinson and the robot grew increasingly important, while Guy Williams's John Robinson, the man originally positioned as the heroic center, had less room to dominate. And something else changed with him. The stories became stranger. By the 2nd and 3rd seasons, Lost in Space could move from genuine danger to circus performers, toys, hippies, and talking vegetables with almost no hesitation. What began with a family lost among the stars was slowly becoming one of television's great monuments to camp. And that transformation leads directly to the first of our 3 notorious episodes. If one episode explains why Lost in Space acquired such an outrageous reputation, it is The Great Vegetable Rebellion. Broadcast on February 28, 1968, as the 23rd episode of Season 3, it arrived near the end of the show's 83-episode run. By then, the Robinsons had encountered enough bizarre creatures that almost nothing should have surprised them. Yet this time, the enemy wasn't an alien soldier or a sophisticated machine. It was a giant, talking carrot. The trouble begins when Dr. Smith casually picks a flower. On this planet, however, vegetation is intelligent, and destroying a flower is treated as murder. Smith is confronted by Tybo, an enormous carrot-like ruler played by character actor Stanley Adams, who had also appeared as Cyrano Jones in Star Trek. Covered in orange makeup and an elaborate vegetable costume, Adams turns what should be a threatening confrontation into one of the strangest images produced by American science fiction television in the 1960s. The episode doesn't stop there. Tybo intends to transform the Robinsons into plant life, while Smith himself begins turning into a giant stalk of celery. What makes the episode fascinating today isn't simply that the premise is ridiculous. It is the contrast with what viewers had been promised 3 years earlier. The series that began with a technologically advanced spacecraft headed for Alpha Centauri was now asking its leading actors to react seriously to murderous vegetables. That tension apparently became difficult even on the set. A frequently repeated behind-the-scenes story claims Guy Williams and June Lockhart struggled to stop laughing while filming scenes involving Tybo. Some later accounts go much further, claiming their behavior resulted in them being suspended for 2 episodes. That dramatic version has circulated widely, but the suspension claim should be treated cautiously unless supported by stronger production records or first-hand testimony. The laughter itself is much easier to understand. The actors had to maintain complete seriousness while standing opposite a man dressed as a gigantic carrot. And this is where the word banned becomes misleading. There is no solid evidence that the Great Vegetable Rebellion remains officially prohibited from television today. Its notoriety comes from something more interesting. It became shorthand for the moment Lost in Space seemed to surrender completely to camp. For viewers who remembered the Robinsons as brave pioneers, Tybo was almost impossible to forget. The episode wasn't dangerous because it crossed some forbidden broadcasting line. It was dangerous to the show's reputation because once audiences had seen Dr. Smith threatened by an angry carrot, there was simply no going back. If the Great Vegetable Rebellion became infamous because of its giant carrot, another third-season episode showed just how comfortable Lost in Space had become with ideas that would have seemed almost impossible during its first year. Collision of Planets, the 9th episode of Season 3, first aired on November 8, 1967. Its threat sounds serious enough. The planet where the Robinsons are temporarily living is on a collision course with another world, and a demolition team arrives with orders to destroy it before impact. Then the demolition team steps out. Instead of military officers or intimidating aliens, the Robinsons meet 4 young, counterculture-styled space travelers dressed in futuristic silver clothing and leather jackets. Their speech, attitudes, and appearance unmistakably echoed the youth culture spreading across America in 1967. The Summer of Love had just transformed San Francisco into the symbolic center of the hippie movement, and Lost in Space turned that contemporary phenomenon into science fiction almost immediately. The result was essentially a group of space hippies carrying the authority to blow up an entire planet. Dr. Smith makes the situation even stranger. After exposure to an alien gas, the normally cowardly, physically unimpressive Smith develops enormous strength. His hair turns green, and Jonathan Harris suddenly gets to play the character almost as a superhuman brute. It is a particularly revealing transformation because Harris had spent the series turning Smith away from the dangerous saboteur introduced in 1965. By late 1967, the same man who once secretly tried to destroy the Jupiter 2 could become a green-haired strongman inside an episode populated by cosmic versions of contemporary hippies. Yet Collision of Planets is important for another reason. Beneath all the silliness, it captures how aggressively Lost in Space absorbed the culture around it. Science fiction has always reflected the period in which it is made, but this series rarely disguised its influences behind complicated allegory. If hippies were suddenly part of America's cultural conversation, Lost in Space could simply put hippies in space. That immediacy also made the show age in a peculiar way. What might have felt topical to CBS viewers in November 1967 can look like an exaggerated time capsule nearly 6 decades later. The clothes, slang, and broad counterculture stereotypes preserve a very specific television interpretation of the late 1960s. Once again, however, notoriety should not be confused with an actual ban. There is no reliable evidence that Collision of Planets is officially banned today. What survives is the kind of episode that can easily generate that mythology because, removed from its 1967 context, some scenes look almost too strange to have been broadcast by a major American network. But the 3rd episode goes further still. It didn't merely bring a piece of 1960s culture into outer space. It turned the Robinsons' adventure into a circus and gave Dr. Smith one of the most wonderfully absurd performances of the entire series. Space Circus, broadcast on October 12, 1966, as the fifth episode of Season 2, represents a different kind of lost in space excess. There is no giant vegetable and no attempt to turn the counterculture into aliens. Instead, the Robinsons encounter something that could have been found on Earth for generations: a traveling circus. The difference is that this one has somehow made its way across the universe. The circus is run by Marvello, played by veteran actor James Westerfield, who arrives with performers, cages, and the familiar visual language of an old-fashioned carnival. Will Robinson becomes fascinated by the visitors and eventually discovers that he possesses unusual abilities that could make him valuable to Marvello's show. That gives the episode a recognizable emotional foundation. A child tempted by the excitement of running away with the circus. What surrounds that simple idea, however, is pure lost in space. One of the circus attractions is a large white-furred creature whose costume has become an easy target for modern viewers because its construction is hardly invisible. Decades before digital effects could hide every seam, television monsters depended on foam, fabric, makeup, and careful camera angles. Lost in Space sometimes made those limitations especially obvious. Rather than destroying the episode, though, that handmade quality became part of why viewers remembered it. Then, Jonathan Harris takes over. Dr. Smith performs a tap dance routine while the robot delivers Tiptoe Through the Tulips in its famously mechanical voice. It is difficult to imagine a sequence further removed from the sinister Smith introduced at the beginning of Season 1. Jonathan Harris was born in 1914 and had spent years working as a serious character actor before Lost in Space, yet here he was using exaggerated movement, comic timing, and theatrical vanity to turn Smith into something closer to an old vaudeville performer stranded on another planet. That shift mattered because Harris understood something the series itself was learning. Smith worked best when danger and comedy existed together. His cowardice could create a problem, his vanity could make it worse, and his attempts to escape responsibility could provide the joke. The character no longer needed to be physically threatening because his personality could drive an entire episode. Space Circus, like the previous examples, has no credible basis for being described as officially banned today. Its value to this story is different. It demonstrates why certain Lost in Space episodes can feel almost unbelievable to viewers discovering them decades later. A series launched as a space survival adventure had reached a point where a robot could sing while its former Cold War saboteur tap-danced beside an interstellar circus. And remarkably, Jonathan Harris wasn't destroying the character by doing it. He was creating the version of Dr. Smith that survived long after the Jupiter 2 stopped flying. After looking closely at these 3 episodes, the biggest surprise is that the title's most dramatic claim doesn't survive a serious fact check. There is no reliable evidence that The Great Vegetable Rebellion, Collision of Planets, or Space Circus is officially banned today. They were broadcast by CBS during the original 1965 to 1968 run, and they have remained part of the series rather than becoming genuinely prohibited episodes hidden from the public. So why does the idea of banned Lost in Space episodes sound so believable? Part of the answer is what happened to the show's reputation after cancellation. Lost in Space lasted 3 seasons and produced 83 episodes, but those episodes represent a remarkable transformation. Viewers who begin with the early black and white installments encounter a recognizable survival adventure. Jump ahead to later episodes without watching that evolution, and suddenly they may see Dr. Smith confronting giant vegetables, gaining superhuman strength around space hippies, or tap dancing beside a singing robot. Without context, it can feel as though you're watching a completely different program. That reputation sometimes obscures how much deliberate creativity existed behind the absurdity. Bob May physically performed the robot while Dick Tufeld supplied the voice audiences heard. John Williams, still frequently credited as Johnny Williams during this period of his career, helped establish the series' musical identity years before Jaws and Star Wars. Most importantly, Jonathan Harris recognized that the original Dr. Smith, a straightforward saboteur, had limited possibilities and progressively transformed him into the cowardly, pompous comic figure who became inseparable from the show. The irony is that the material most likely to embarrass a conventional science fiction production became part of what preserved Lost in Space. The giant carrot is remembered. The robot singing is remembered. Smith's theatrical cowardice is remembered. More polished television programs from the same period disappeared almost completely from popular conversation. Even the series itself disappeared unexpectedly. CBS canceled Lost in Space in 1968 after 3 seasons. Various explanations have circulated ever since, ranging from production costs and ratings concerns to June Lockhart's later account that Irwin Allen failed to provide requested story outlines for a proposed 4th season. That last explanation is fascinating, but it should be treated as an account rather than the single conclusively established cause of cancellation. What isn't disputed is what happened next. There was no 4th season. Guy Williams never returned to another major television starring role and eventually spent much of his later life in Argentina, where his earlier portrayal of Zorro had made him extraordinarily popular. Jonathan Harris continued acting for decades and died in 2002 at 87. Yet the strange little world they created refused to disappear. And perhaps that is the real story behind these supposedly banned episodes. They weren't erased because they went too far. They survived precisely because they went further than almost anyone expected a 1960s family science fiction show to go. Lost in Space was never afraid to become strange, and these 3 episodes prove just how far it was willing to go. They may not actually be banned today, but giant carrots, space hippies, and a tap-dancing Dr. Smith certainly explain why that legend refuses to die. Which of these episodes do you remember, and which one went too far for you? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this trip back to classic television, like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story.